Welcome, everyone, to the third Nietzsche podcast book club. This time, we're going to dive in to the gay science, and we're going to use Walter Kaufmann's translation, as is the norm. I'm very excited to get into this one with all of you, so thank you very much for joining me. I should say a couple things very quickly at the outset, that we're going to do a couple things a little bit differently from previous walkthroughs of Nietzsche's books. We've done Beyond Good and Evil and The Birth of Tragedy, and I'm normally a completionist when it comes to this podcast in general. But this time, we're going to be a bit looser because we're not going to discuss everything in the work. We're not going to discuss Nietzsche's poems, mainly, which begin the book. And that's because the analysis of poems and philosophical analysis are two very different things, and I don't think it would be good for the pacing of the series to begin by analyzing a series of poems. Secondly, we're only going to spend a little bit of time discussing the background of the work, and that's because we've discussed the context of the gay science already on the podcast in great detail. So just to get into that very briefly, this is the final work of Nietzsche's middle period, also known as the Free Spirit Trilogy, which consists of Human All Too Human, Daybreak, and the Gay Science. This period is the beginning of Nietzsche's philosophical career after he left the university owing to worsening health problems, migraines, nausea, near blindness, and so on. And Nietzsche would later, he would go on to move on from or modify some of the ideas from this period, and accordingly in 1887, Nietzsche would author a new preface for this book, and in fact he writes a new preface for all of his early works and included them in the new editions. So the first edition of The Gay Science came out in 1882, and that leads directly into Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the work in which Nietzsche believes that his philosophy matured. His great ideas reached fruition in that work. Accordingly, when Nietzsche adds these new prefaces in 1887, he sort of attempts to contextualize the middle period as this time of convalescence. He was getting well from a long illness, so to speak. And in this case, not only is he attempting to live with his physical illness, some of the worst years of Nietzsche's life in terms of his health, but also Nietzsche is getting over an intellectual illness, and we might broadly call that romanticism. The specific strain of romanticism that Nietzsche contracted was Wagnerianism. Nietzsche had been under the sway of Wagner's ideas in his personality cult for some time, during his friendship with Wagner. He'd also been a thoroughgoing devotee of Schopenhauer, that great pessimist. Nietzsche describes in these retrospective prefaces how each book during this period was another step in the process of getting well, of liberating himself from these old ideas that he now considered to be resignationist. He asks in his in the preface to Birth of Tragedy, for example, whether there is a pessimism of strength in contrast to Schopenhauer's pessimism of weakness. And in his preface to Human All Too Human, he says that Wagner was nothing more than a helpless, despairing romantic. And so, with that bit of background, we will get into that preface now. Another thing that we're going to do a bit differently, I'm not going to just read the entire preface straight through because much of the information there and that context that Nietzsche is giving of getting over his illness, of his convalescence, is another thing that we've covered in great detail on the podcast. We are, however, I want to go through and pick out a few chunks of the preface or a few passages from the preface just to read from because not only is the prose very good, but there are a few things that are worth looking at. I just didn't want to read the whole thing in completion because, again, a lot of it is ground that we've already covered. And one of the things that he says is, quote, "I do not want to take leave ungratefully from that time of severe sickness whose profits I have not yet exhausted even today. A philosopher who has traversed many kinds of health and keeps traversing them has passed through an equal number of philosophies." End quote. Different degrees of health or degrees of sickness, whichever angle you want to look at it from, those different degrees of health or sickness have determined the perspectives expressed throughout the various life philosophies that have been offered throughout history. And Nietzsche invokes the idea of a, quote, philosophical physician, which echoes the notion first explored in his essay Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, that the philosopher can act as a sort of physician to culture, a physician that diagnoses the health or sickness of a culture. But importantly, Nietzsche says he's still waiting for such a figure to arrive. His philosophers of the future, that he would later write about in Beyond Good and Evil, for example, that he says in that work are soon coming. That is really what he's talking about with a new kind of philosophical physician. And in the case of most philosophers of the past, Nietzsche says they have actually not offered us a reliable interpretation of our situation. We might say a reliable diagnosis, because the philosophers were themselves afflicted, so to speak. Nietzsche remarks elsewhere in the preface, quote, "I have often asked myself whether, taking a large view, philosophy has not merely been an interpretation of the body, and a misunderstanding of the body. Behind the highest value judgments that have hitherto guided the history of thought, there are concealed misunderstandings of the physical constitution, of individuals, or classes, or even whole races. All those bold insanities of metaphysics, especially answers to the questions about the value of existence, may be considered first of all as symptoms of certain bodies." End quote. So, accordingly, Nietzsche represents himself as one who has trained his discerning eye through this very process of passing through many stages of health and sickness. And not by doing as most philosophers do, quote, "We philosophers, if we should become sick, surrender for a while to sickness and as it were shut our eye to ourselves," end quote. In some cases, he argues, it is one's deprivations that philosophize. In other words, their wants or their lacks. That's what's doing the philosophizing. Whereas in other cases, it's one's strengths. And so Nietzsche says his own strength is what he calls a tremendous hope that he's had to win for himself after a long and seemingly hopeless battle. Quote, "Gay science, that signifies the saturnalia of a spirit who has patiently resisted a terrible long pressure, patiently, severely, coldly, without submitting, but also without hope, and who is now all at once attacked by hope, the hope for health and the intoxication of convalescence." End quote. So, some very nice Nietzschean oxymorons there. The idea of being attacked by hope, or being intoxicated by convalescence, right? We would think of illness maybe as a state of, if not intoxication, the idea of being sort of feverish and out of your right mind, and being healthy is a state of sobriety. Nietzsche here is intoxicated with the idea of becoming healthy again. He's attacked as by something violent and aggressive by hope. So Nietzsche says in this preface, it's his own great pride that stopped him from succumbing to the ordinary temptations of the sick mind. And just as one who philosophizes out of a feeling of deprivation feels their philosophical activity to be a kind of tax or a drain on their energy, a labor or a chore, for Nietzsche, he says that philosophy is a kind of beautiful luxury. Quote, "The voluptuousness of a triumphant gratitude that eventually still has to inscribe itself in cosmic letters on the heaven of concepts." End quote. That's another way that Nietzsche argues that his philosophy stands alone as a different kind of activity from most other philosophy, for perhaps all other philosophy, that in the depths of his sickness and his suffering, he finds the will to author a philosophy which is a kind of conscious gratitude to life, or he describes it as a kind of play. He invokes the idea here of a heaven of concepts, I think, for precisely this purpose, because the conceptual world is no more real than heaven is to Nietzsche. The book that we have here, The Gay Science, this is an artistic affair. It's an expression of a certain sentiment, a certain perspective. It's not a dreary labor that must prove something. It's not a development of philosophical thought toward a given outcome or ultimate end that Nietzsche is attempting to engineer. Elsewhere, he says that he's allowed for what he calls self-questioning, self-temptation. He's allowed himself to become familiar with those sick states of the soul that go hand in hand with sick states of the body. The type of philosopher that Nietzsche wishes to see in the future and that he aspires to be the sort of the forerunner of. On the other hand, these types are, quote, are not free to divide body and soul as the people do. We are even less free to divide soul from spirit, end quote. I think the most important conclusion that Nietzsche draws from this direct experience with such sick states and his own process of getting well, it's articulated here in this preface, and it ties into the most central idea of Nietzsche's, and it's the starting point that we've used on the podcast. Nietzsche's understanding of metaphysics, of idealism more broadly. Metaphysics as a kind of rejection of the physical, or as a kind of rejection of the sensuous, idealism as expressing a want or a lack, therefore. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, "Now one knows whether the sick body and its needs unconsciously urge, push, and lure the spirit toward the sun, stillness, mildness, patience, medicine, balm in some sense. Every philosophy that ranks peace above war, every ethic with a negative definition of happiness, every metaphysics and physics that knows some finale, some final state of some sort, every predominantly aesthetic or religious craving for some apart, beyond, outside, above, permits the question whether it was not sickness that inspired the philosopher." End quote. So the overall thrust of the passage is that through his familiarity, his intimacy with sickness, Nietzsche is able to have a fine and discerning eye for it. Since he's a man of ideas himself, he's able to see how this sickness manifests in the world of ideas. And since there's no distinction between body and soul, we can reorient our understanding of those ideas as being symptoms of a physiological reality, of a physical reality. And this is, I think, quite obviously very different approach to thinking about ideas than we get from Kant or Hegel, Plato for that matter. And Nietzsche says this process was obviously very painful for him because it involved a great deal of ill health on his own part, a great deal of his own suffering, physical suffering, but he says he doesn't regret this. Again, he says he's grateful to it. He writes, quote, "Only great pain, the long, slow pain that takes its time, on which we are burned, as it were, with green wood, compels us philosophers to descend into our ultimate depths and to put aside all trust, everything good-natured, everything that would impose a veil that is mild, that is medium, things in which formerly we may have found our humanity. I doubt that such pain makes us better, but I know it makes us more profound." End quote. His final remarks in the preface warn us against fetishizing this profundity that is found in suffering. He says it's bad taste to seek for the truth at any price, and that form of the will to truth, it characterizes those who would wish to, quote, "unveil, uncover, and put into a bright light whatever is kept concealed for good reasons." End quote. So this is not a martyrdom on behalf of truth. This is a work of merrymaking, as Nietzsche describes it earlier in the preface. It is, as the title suggests, a joyous book, which is intended in the tradition of the Geia Scientia, which was the profession of the provincial night poets, the troubadours. And that is why I have maintained using that translation of the title in English, the gay science, and not the joyous science, because the name Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, to render it literally, means something like the frolicking science, which does not merely indicate joyfulness, but a kind of carefree attitude. As Kaufmann argues in his translator's introduction to the work, even that modern connotation of the term that has to do with sexuality, the reason why that was adopted in the first place is because it implies this kind of lighthearted flaunting of convention. And so that attitude ties in with Nietzsche's cheerfulness in his immoralism. We should also note the comparison to Emerson, also mentioned by Kaufmann, and his coinage, the professors of a joyous science, which undoubtedly influenced Nietzsche in terms of the overall feeling of the work. But Geia Scientia, I think, is best rendered in English as the gay science, if for no other reason than the fact that both of the words are cognates, Geia Scientia, gay science. So the work is to be understood, first and foremost, as an artistic production, as an expression of Nietzsche's newfound hope. It's colored by this gay, carefree attitude that rejects the grave seriousness of the person who wants to be martyred for their own truth, or the rigorous philosophical system builder, or the academic bowing before every trivial fact. And this artistic nature of the work has a profound philosophical meaning in and of itself, because it places Nietzsche on the side of appearance, on the side of the phenomenal world, on the side of the physical and the physiological. That is the root. That's the foundation, right? The world of the senses, the world of feeling and desire, that's what's real. And whatever Nietzsche inscribes into the heaven of concepts is to be understood within that framework. And so Nietzsche concludes his preface to the Gay Science as follows, quote, "Oh, those Greeks, they knew how to live. What is required for that is to stop courageously at the surface, the fold, the skin, to adore appearance, to believe in forms, tones, words, and in the whole Olympus of appearance. Those Greeks were superficial, out of profundity. And is not this precisely what we are again coming back to, we daredevils of the spirit who have climbed the highest and most dangerous peak of present thought, and looked around from up there? We who have looked down from there, are we not precisely in this respect Greeks, adorers of forms, of tones, of words, and therefore artists?" End quote. So the key point here, that the Greeks are superficial out of profundity. I think that statement in itself can more or less encapsulate the underlying thrust of that anti-metaphysical sentiment, as we discussed in the first episode of the podcast when we talked about how the true world finally became a fable. Superficial here means a concern with the world as it appears. And that's because when we descend to the depths and examine the origins, the psychological origins, and thus the physiological origins of all metaphysics, of all positing of a beyond and above, etc., we find the origin of all of that is sickness. The healthy soul, on the other hand, lives in the appearance, lives in the world as it appears, lives in the world that he knows and feels in his senses. He's superficial then from the perspective of the Platonist or the mystic, but that's because such figures have gotten lost within those hinterworlds of idealism. And so the Gay Science truly is philosophy with this artistic mindset of getting invested in the appearance. It's a unity of body and soul, a unity of profundity and superficiality, and a unity, perhaps most importantly, of cheerfulness with the search for the truth, which would be a unity of the spirit of Socrates with the spirit of the artist. This book is Nietzsche's experiment in whether the approach to philosophy of an artistic Socrates is truly possible, a Socrates that practices music. And those were the thoughts going through his head as he re-examined many of his early works during this time. So with that, we'll move on from the preface and jump right in to the first book of the Gay Science, beginning with aphorism 1, entitled "The Teachers of the Purpose of Existence." Quote, "Whether I contemplate men with benevolence or with an evil eye, I always find them concerned with a single task, all of them and every one of them in particular, to do what is good for the preservation of the human race. Not from any feeling of love for the race, but merely because nothing in them is older, stronger, more inexorable and unconquerable than this instinct, because this instinct constitutes the essence of our species, our herd. It is easy enough to divide our neighbors quickly with the usual myopia from a mere 5 paces away into useful and harmful, good and evil men. But in any large-scale accounting, when we reflect on the whole a little longer, we become suspicious of this neat division and finally abandon it. Even the most harmful man may really be the most useful when it comes to the preservation of the species, for he nurtures either in himself or in others, through his effects, instincts without which humanity would long have become feeble or rotten. Hatred, the mischievous delight in the misfortunes of others, the lust to rob and dominate, and whatever else is called evil, belongs to the most amazing economy of the preservation of the species. To be sure, This economy is not afraid of high prices, of squandering, and it is, on the whole, extremely foolish. Still, it is proven that it has preserved our race so far. I no longer know whether you, my dear fellow man and neighbor, are at all capable of living in a way that would damage the species. In other words, unreasonably and badly. What might have harmed the species may have become extinct many thousands of years ago, and may by now be one of those things that are not possible even for God. Pursue your best or worst desires, and above all, perish. In both cases, you are probably still in some way a promoter and benefactor of humanity, and therefore entitled to your eulogists, but also to your detractors. End quote. So, there's nothing, absolutely nothing you can do that can harm the species, Nietzsche says. Which, it's a very startling claim to begin with. It's almost sort of like an extended koan for us to contemplate, because it is, at first, a rather shocking claim. But I think with a bit of contemplation, we will see there's something quite profound behind it. The simple fact that whether we, each one of us, in our own individual lives, attempts to help or harm those individuals around us, we are inevitably helping the entire species on that level of analysis. Why? Because even the most harmful man keeps the rest of us on our toes. What is it that the herd does, that society does? It creates city walls that protect its people from threats from without. And it establishes laws and establishes rules and social mores that are intended to protect its people from one another. But what would be the long-term effect of such safety, such security from danger? Well, Nietzsche's writing here in the wake of great revelations within the sciences, particularly within biology and anthropology, the most famous forerunner of which is Darwin, although Nietzsche himself didn't like Darwin very much, for various reasons I'm sure we'll get into as we continue with our read-through here. He much preferred the work of Lamarck. But regardless, Nietzsche is doing philosophy that actually takes into account the fact of mankind as a historical being. That is to say, as a being that evolved, that changed and transformed over time. He's not considering mankind as an individual, but as a species. And how does such a change happen on the level of the species? It happens due to conflict, hardship, deprivation, suffering, death. It happens through the culling blade of natural selection. It was from a great need that the first proto-humans left the forest and wandered onto the savanna. And on that savanna, they were subjected to new pressures, the selection pressures of large predatory cats, which they were, for the most part, they were no match for them. But they had to make that migration to this new environment, to search for new sources of food, to find some way of preserving themselves, preserving being such as they were. And it was in the tempering fire of being hunted by new predators and searching for new means of nutriment that they eventually became human beings as we are now. And so were the predators and the environmental hardship, all of the lot of suffering that's given to the many species of planet Earth, starvation, injury, disease, death by being eaten alive, which it's really a fate that many of us probably can't imagine in terms of just how awful it would really be and how common it must be, almost universal among most of, if you'll pardon the sacrilegious phrase, among most of God's creatures. Being eaten alive is probably the normal fate. And I believe it was Nick Land, that famous or infamous Marxist turned accelerationist, who described the condition of nature as akin to the religious conception of hell, and argued that every single aspect of mankind that we find valuable, every instance of beauty, grace, virtue, and so on, was tempered in the fires of hell, is his poetic way of saying it. And Land was very influenced by Nietzsche, by the way. And so that's all to say that in the state of nature, which is impossible to describe as a place of happiness or, fulfillment, cooperation, harmony, all of these notions that we have within civilization, the state of nature is rather defined by suffering. The total picture of nature is suffering beings begetting other suffering beings in this never-ending cycle That nevertheless seems to yield up progress, not like social or political progress necessarily, but biological progress in the form of more complex, more powerful, more beautiful organisms. But it's all forged in the fires of hell, as Nick Land would say. And so we return then to the problem of civilization within all this. Obviously, every living thing strives to make itself free of the suffering that characterizes nature. And we should say that that impulse itself to escape from suffering is just as much a part of this driving engine of nature, this driving engine that is aimed at the betterment of the species, just as that default state of suffering is also part of it. We naturally seek for pleasure, which you could understand pleasure or happiness here in either a positive or negative sense. It really doesn't matter. But we try to pull ourselves out of the hell of nature at every moment, and it's that push and pull that advances the species. Without the need to be on guard and to fight against predators and so on, that process of advancement would stop. And so, in the broader sense, we require violent and aberrant individuals, murderers, thieves, bandits and throwbacks and Napoleons and the criminally insane and so on and so forth in order to advance the species. And why? Well, because they stop us from becoming soft. It is in the fight against them that we find that driving engine of our advancement on the biological level. The victory over these aberrant or violent elements is not itself what advances the species. It's the fight that advances the species. The fight is what is valuable. More to the point, Nietzsche says he doubts whether any of you, any human being alive today, could actually harm the species no matter what they do, whether they're the most harmful or the most benign person. No instinct is older and has been nurtured longer than those instincts, or we might say all of the instincts within us that are the oldest and have been nurtured the longest are those which have survived. And he says, even though nature is such a wasteful, squandering process, the very fact that we're here and we have been preserved is proof that nature is effective in this task. And so we're all condemned to advance the species, whether we want to or not. And notice Nietzsche says, and above all, perish. And, that's why it's a bit funny when people attempt to take Nietzsche prescriptively, because even his prescriptions are descriptive in their way. Because, if you were to take this as a sort of moral dictate, which is would nevertheless be subtly sort of ironic, we have no choice. That is really the thrust of this passage. And perishing is something you certainly have no choice in, just as you have no choice in whether or not your life will advance the species. Remember that, within a year, he writes Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which his main character exalts us all to go under, which means to die, to perish attempting the great and impossible. And so we see this message prefigured here. And I think the statement, again, is fairly straightforward. It may even be intended to shock, but it has a very sharp meaning to it. The individual is not important to nature. The species is. Your own perishing will, of course, be something that you regard as the worst calamity of all existence. It's the end of your existence, of course. And yet your perishing is only an instrument of nature. It's something that happens for nature's higher purposes. And so Nietzsche says, pursue your best or your worst instincts. Because in some sense, the idea of dividing your best from your worst instincts is about as ridiculous as dividing your morally good from your morally bad neighbors, as Nietzsche suggests earlier in the passage. That's a kind of myopia, of short-sightedness, of single-mindedness or something like that. Because on the whole, seen from the highest possible perspective, all your instincts are of worth to the species. All of your quote-unquote worst instincts must have been developed and enhanced by that tempering fire of nature, just as your best instincts were. So who is to say that they are worse? Again, there's something very Spinozist about it in a way, right? That the individual modifications of nature, as Spinoza says, will have their perception of what is good and bad to them. But from the perspective of nature itself, there's nothing that is good or bad. It's all simply part of the same whole. So Nietzsche goes on in the rest of the paragraph, which I'll kind of gloss over here, to suggest that we all learn to laugh at ourselves, to embrace with that kind of devil-may-care attitude all those impulses within ourselves that society calls not just bad, but shameful, or that we might even regard as embarrassing. To recognize I am what I am, and even those parts of me that someone else might call any number of names, impious, immoral, or, in modern times, degenerate or reactionary, all of those impulses that from whatever angle, whatever the case may be, someone might denigrate you for, that's all part of the amazing economy of nature. And, quote, to laugh at oneself as one would have to laugh in order to laugh out of the whole truth, end quote. That's what the kind of laughter we should be aiming at. I'm reminded of that phrase that, life seen from the grandest possible perspective. Is it a tragedy or a comedy? I mean, Nietzsche in many ways is saying, on the individual level, life is tragic, but on the grand scale, we should see it as a comedy. But, he raises the issue. Is humanity as a whole ready to laugh like this yet? And if this is taken to be Nietzsche's mission statement, to teach us all to laugh at ourselves, not to weep at the state of the world, not to lament it, but to laugh at it, then I think such a message has to go hand in hand with that call to understand ourselves as those who live our lives for the purposes of giving rise to an even greater and even better version of mankind, seeing the comic nature of the entire satyr play of human existence, and seeing our lives as parts within that whole, which again it might be strange to think of Nietzsche arguing in those terms, but he makes it very clear here, quote, when the proposition the species is everything, one is always none, has become part of humanity, and this ultimate liberation and irresponsibility has become accessible to all at all times, perhaps laughter will then have formed an alliance with wisdom. Perhaps only gay science will then be left. End quote. Knowing what we know about the trajectory of Nietzsche's career, I actually don't think it's so incongruous with his later writings, because as he writes in his notes in Will to Power, he says his project is aimed at breeding, not at an individualist philosophy. So even though there are those individualist elements to Nietzsche's thought, and there's a way in which he does not ever want to reduce the multiplicity of humanity to just one monistic thing, what we actually see here, I think, the way of untangling all of this, is that we have the prefiguration of the Overman idea. The idea that Nietzsche is a nihilist is also similarly untenable in light of this passage, because he believes there is a meaning to existence, a purpose to it, and in absentia of God or in absentia of metaphysics, we must look to the purpose that nature has given our existence, and that is to create better, stronger offspring, better than ourselves. And we can conceive that one day they might become so transformed, not just our great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren, but 50, 100, 1,000 generations removed or more, that they could become so transformed as to have left behind even our humanity, just as we've left behind the ape, and now we regard such lower species of primates as a laughingstock and a painful embarrassment. But the understanding of this existential condition of mankind, Nietzsche says, if it ever was embraced, would be a kind of liberation. And I think that's very important to bring out in this passage, because it would be very easy to take a depressing view of the species as primary, as many do. But Nietzsche says it would be a liberation. Why? Well, because it liberates us from the moral judgment over existence, that division of good neighbors from bad neighbors, that division of good instincts and bad instincts. Instead of that, we can just forgive the entirety of it. We can christen the entire play of existence as all valuable, all useful for nature's purposes. And so existence becomes innocent again. existence becomes that comedy. And how does that happen? It's not by means of romantic irrationalism either, and that's another mischaracterization of Nietzsche. It's by the comedy of this existence becoming conscious of itself. That, in fact, the division of types of people or instincts into good and bad is quite natural. As Deleuze says when he's interpreting Nietzsche's claims in Genealogy, Deleuze says that if we could imagine a little lamb who were intelligent enough to become a logician, he would no doubt come to the logical conclusion that to prey on little lambs is immoral. And the same is true of the gazelle. The same is true of the proto-humans out on the savannah. And we are, in fact, the example of that among the animal kingdom. We attained consciousness, and we used that consciousness to inscribe into logical formulae the very things that we were conditioned by nature to believe. It's not the rejection of that becoming conscious that Nietzsche aims for, though. What Nietzsche's aiming for is the completion of that becoming conscious. It's fulfillment. Because once we're fully conscious, and not just conscious of the fact that, for example, the predatory individual harms the society by attacking it, therefore we should have rules against predatory behavior. That's maybe a sort of preliminary or rather basic form of becoming conscious. That's, again, like the little lamb who becomes a logician, simply taking whatever it is that, we, as a particular modification of nature that suits our advantage or disadvantage, and then consciously articulating it and then calling it a metaphysical or moral rule. But once we take things a step further and we're fully conscious that, okay, wait, on another level, the predatory individual helps the society by strengthening the society, forcing it to fight against him, then the apparent tragedies or calamities caused by such predatory individuals now appear as instrumental toward a grander triumph, a grander comedy that is above all the individual tragedies. And so this innocence of existence is therefore achieved by transcending moralism. But Nietzsche does not believe that even this moralism that he wishes to overcome, even that has not been harmful, as I've mentioned. So Nietzsche writes, and I'm going to quote here in abridged form, still in section 1, "What is the meaning of the ever-new appearance of these founders of moralities and religions, these instigators of fights over moral valuations, these teachers of remorse and religious wars? What is the meaning of these heroes on the stage?" End quote. And I should say briefly, Nietzsche here accuses even the poets and the tragedians. And, of course, all the priests and the philosophers are thrown into that lot too. But even the tragedians, right? They're mere valets of some morality, he calls them. But they too, quote, "promote the interests of the species, even if they should believe that they promote the interest of God or work as God's emissaries. They too promote the life of the species by promoting the faith in life. Life is worth living, every one of them shouts. There is something to life. There is something behind life, beneath it. Beware." End quote. And that particular chunk, that can be a particularly hard passage to untangle. And it's probably harder, actually, the more that one has read Nietzsche and the more that one understands this passage in context of Nietzsche's broader work. The reason why I think it's actually harder, the more you know, is because Nietzsche would go on to write that all of the philosophers and priests and moralists, in fact, have a hidden agenda that is anti-life. That they actually say life is not worth living. That, in some sense, this is his great discovery about the sickness of philosophy, the fact that all philosophers have been a little more than a subspecies of priest. So is he contradicting himself here? Well, I would argue, and this is just my own method of interpretation, maybe I can sort of explicate my own methods here for those of you who might struggle to interpret philosophical texts. So just my 2 cents on this. You should be able to interpret the text on many levels, and if it doesn't make sense in the context of the broader work, you should actually narrow the context and consider it merely in the context of the passage. And so what is he saying in the context of this passage? If we consider that, I think the meaning becomes clear. There is something behind life, beneath life, beware. And so, in other words, the Christian interpretation of life, well, let's think about the Christian interpretation of life. That makes it into a moral struggle. Life is like a battle for the souls of mankind, in which metaphysical forces of good and evil contest with one another behind the scenes. For the individual, there becomes interposed onto life the highest possible stakes, eternal reward or eternal damnation. And so in other places in his work, when Nietzsche is critiquing the Christian religion, for its life denial, it is for the same reason, but simply seen from a different angle. The Christian says life is worth living, but only insofar as we are commanded by God, one would say, to live a good Christian life. And one does this for the sake of their salvation in heaven. These are the elements of Christianity that, in Nietzsche's notes, he would say are the most beneficial aspects of Christianity. These are the aspects that gave mankind some means of justifying life and redeeming life. Even if it was ultimately imaginary, something coming out of a psychological need, Christianity tells us life is for something. Life has some purpose, some meaning, and all of the suffering that goes on in it will be in some way transcended. And I think one way to substantiate that claim, that the world religions have this effect, in precisely the way Nietzsche is describing, is to simply look at the fact that religious zealots often have no compunction about, say, dying in battle or being martyred for their beliefs. To Nietzsche, that is, in some sense, a beautiful thing, the willingness to fearlessly perish in the name of some great ideal. And that, I guess that is a way of, we might say, beautifully dying, but it's also a way of, what Nietzsche says would be truly living dangerously, living in such a way that your sacrifice preserves your group or your offspring or your way of life or something like that. And the only problem with this point of view is that the ideal itself sends the value off into the afterlife. And so Nietzsche's understanding here of man as serving the purposes of nature, Nietzsche's new understanding that we are not serving God, even if we think so, we're actually serving nature's purposes, that new understanding would relocate the value. The value is constantly manifest within life itself. This lie, the illusion of heaven, salvation, God's will, etc., this is all a powerful inducement to trick ourselves into serving the economy of nature. And so Nietzsche is tearing off that mask. He's ripping away the veil so we can bring our awareness of that process, as we've said, into full consciousness. And so to that end, he writes, quote, "From time to time, this instinct, which is at work equally in the highest and the basest men, the instinct for the preservation of the species, erupts as reason and as passion of the spirit. Then it is surrounded by a resplendent retinue of reasons, and tries with all the force at its command to make us forget that at bottom it is instinct, drive, folly, lack of reasons. Life shall be loved because man shall advance himself and his neighbor because. What names all these shalls and becauses receive, and may yet receive in the future? In order that what happens necessarily and always, spontaneously and without any purpose, may henceforth appear to be done for some purpose, and strike man as rational and an ultimate commandment, the ethical teacher comes on stage as the teacher of the purpose of existence. And to this end, he invents a second, different existence, and unhinges by means of his new mechanics the old ordinary existence. Indeed, he wants to make sure that we do not laugh at existence or at ourselves, or at him. For him, one is always one, something first and last and tremendous. For him, there are no species, sums, or zeros. His inventions and valuations may be utterly foolish and over-enthusiastic. He may badly misjudge the course of nature and deny its conditions, and all ethical systems hitherto have been so foolish and anti-natural that humanity would have perished of every one of them if it had gained power over humanity. And yet, whenever the hero appeared on the stage, something new was attained. The gruesome counterpart of laughter, that profound emotional shock felt by many individuals at the thought, yes, I am worthy of living, Life and I and you and all of us became interesting to ourselves once again for a little while. There is no denying that in the long run, every one of these great teachers of a purpose was vanquished by laughter, reason, and nature. The short tragedy always gave way again and returned into the eternal comedy of existence, and the, quote, waves of uncountable laughter, decide Aeschylus, must in the end overwhelm even the greatest of these tragedians. In spite of all this laughter, which makes the required corrections, human nature has nevertheless been changed by the ever-new appearance of these teachers of the purpose of existence. It now has one additional need: the need for the ever-new appearance of such teachers and teachings of a purpose. End quote. So, to look at his remarks on tragedy and tragedians here, I think it's helpful to think not so much of Aeschylus, who he mentions. I mean, he mentions Aeschylus, but the line he cites for him is, waves and waves of laughter. So, really who he's talking about, I think, if we look at his remarks in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks once more, he's referring to figures that he says comported themselves as though they were the hero of a tragedy. People like Anaximander or Parmenides, or I believe Anaxagoras would be another one. Figures who saw existence as tragic precisely because they had interposed another world on top of this one. In Anaximander's case, he says that existence was inherently a guilty thing, that we all stole our individual existence from an indefinite origin that he calls the apeiron, and that we had to make penance for our existence, for having stolen our existence by being destroyed, by dying. That's the reason for arising and passing away, and it's the introduction of a moral interpretation of existence into the Greek mind, long before Plato, in fact. And he uses the phrase that this is foolish and anti-natural, these people who try to teach us the purpose of existence by interposing another world on top of it. Because, well, it's foolish because they're giving us a reason to do something, a shall and because, that we will do anyway. We will live, we will exist, we will perish, and existence will continue to perpetuate itself. Nietzsche's view of this is very similar to Heraclitus. He sees existence as this sort of, what would we say? What does he say? It's instinct, drive, folly, lack of reasons. Life shall be loved because, well, life shall simply be loved, right? And those who want to introduce the because and teach us a purpose of existence, this almost always comes with that, again, interposing of another world, and then therefore, from the perspective of that other world, judging or condemning this existence, and that's why it becomes anti-natural. And he talks about this all the way until the end of his career in Twilight of Idols, the passage Morality as Anti-Nature. But again, even that, these teachers of the purpose of existence, and these teachings of the purpose of existence, he says that as soon as they come onto the stage, they're vanquished by laughter. And so there's a sort of self-correction even for this. And that even though if they were allowed to gain full reign over the direction of the species, of the human organism, they would no doubt turn it into something anti-natural, something that would begin to not advance, but to degenerate, we might say. There is a self-corrective mechanism for that within nature. And in a way, he's saying it's laughter. But I take this all as a very metaphorical sort of supposition, that the figure who positions himself as the tragic hero is always vanquished by laughter. It's not as if, we overcome Plato and Kant and, the Christian religion and so on and so forth simply by people laughing at it. But there is, there is truth to that, allegorically speaking, and that just in the same way that we look back on the ape, on previous iterations of the organism as a laughing stock, as Nietzsche says in Zarathustra, we also tend to look back on our old pagan religions and mythologies as sort of, an object of laughter, that there may come a time when we look back on the Christian stories in the same way, that they've ceased to have any power over us, and now it's all just a comedy show. And so given everything that we've discussed, it may be, a bit of an irony, you might say, that Nietzsche, in some sense, is positioning himself as a new teacher of the purpose of existence. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, the old world religions, the old philosophies, Platonism, German idealism, and so on, even the works of the poets and the tragedians, those were all attempts to teach mankind the purpose of existence, but they were guided by illusions and misjudgments, that they were affixing shalls and becauses to what nature already says that we must be and must do. But by telling us that, and by giving us this picture of the purpose of existence, that being that it's all part of this struggle to advance the species, Nietzsche is once again doing that. He's teaching us a purpose of existence. But the difference here, and I think we have to hammer this point home because it's a very important difference, we have no choice in this. Everything we do advances the species. So whereas the old teachers of the purpose of existence would sort of come along and say, if you don't do this, there's going to be trouble, right? If you don't become a Christian, you're going to be punished in hell. Nietzsche says, you have no choice. You're going to advance the species whether you like it or not. And so in this mission statement, so to speak, in the first passage, we have so many Nietzschean concepts. They all interrelate in this passage. So we have amor fati, the love of fate. The species must advance and nothing you can do will change that. And the acceptance of that, the love of that, it's shown by laughter rather than feeling as though you're compelled or in chains. And we have the overman prefigured, the concept of the ever-advancing power and beauty of the human race. And above all, we have the mendaciousness of consciousness, the notion that consciousness so far, the story of consciousness has not been a struggle that brings us closer and closer to the unvarnished truth. Rather, it's been a series of errors and follies. And that also is deserving of our laughter. And the purpose of consciousness, in some sense, was never going to be to deliver us to that objective truth with a capital T. And why? Well, because our consciousness, our intelligence, does not exist for that purpose. It exists for nature's purposes. It exists as one more inducement to trick us into living our lives for the advancement of the species. That is the uniqueness of the human animal. He is conscious, he's rational, but the value of those things are not that they lead us to the truth. They don't lead us to this dispassionate truth found in the lap of being itself. The value is that man becomes an animal with a conception of nature's purpose. That is the clarity that consciousness could attain. And it's still a sort of trick, right? That man should become the animal with faith in something, an animal with a reason for his existence or a conception of the meaning of his existence that he brings into his own awareness. Nietzsche's hope is that he could teach us as a new type of the teacher of the purpose of existence, that he could lead us to live our lives and love our lives without having to interpose that additional other world, which is created by the mendacious consciousness, and always with a moral aim. And so with that, we will finish out the passage. Quote, gradually, man has become a fantastic animal that has to fulfill one more condition of existence than any other animal. Man has to believe, to know from time to time why he exists. His race cannot flourish without a periodic trust in life, without faith and reason in life. And again, the human race will decree from time to time. There is something at which it is absolutely forbidden henceforth to laugh. The most cautious friend of man will add, not only laughter and gay wisdom, but the tragic too, with all its sublime unreason, belongs among the means and necessities of the preservation of the species. Consequently, oh, do you understand me, my brothers? Do you understand this new law of ebb and flood? There is a time for us, too. End quote. So, I think most of the end of that is fairly self-explanatory. I mean, his comments at the end are a bit enigmatic, but overall, the thrust of the concluding paragraph is the recognition that man now requires a new need, some sort of reason for his life. And, he adds that remark at the end that I sort of already attempted to flesh out. Even those tragic figures who attempted to teach us the meaning of existence for some moral aim, even these were part of the means and necessities of the preservation of the species. Consequently, do you understand me? In other words, there's no way out of this. And so even Nietzsche's attempt at his own teaching of the purposes of existence is not really a contradiction, because Nietzsche himself is just one more instrument in the hands of nature at advancing the human race. And really the difference is he's doing it in full embrace of the comedy of existence, and without that dictate that there's something that you cannot laugh at. We can laugh at everything here. That's the mission statement of the gay science. Okay, so let's move on to section 2. This is entitled The Intellectual Conscience. Quote, I keep having the same experience and keep resisting it every time. I do not want to believe it, although it is palpable. The great majority of people lacks an intellectual conscience. Indeed, it has often seemed to me as if anyone calling for an intellectual conscience were as lonely in the most densely populated cities as if he were in a desert. Everybody looks at you with strange eyes and goes right on handling his scales, calling this good and that evil. Nobody even blushes when you intimate that their weights are underweight, nor do people feel outraged. They merely laugh at your doubts. I mean, the great majority of people does not consider it contemptible to believe this or that and to live accordingly, without first having given themselves an account of the final and most certain reasons pro and con, and without even troubling themselves about such reasons afterward. The most gifted men and noblest women still belong to this great majority. But what is good-heartedness, refinement, or genius to me when the person who has these virtues tolerates slack feelings in his faith and judgments when he does not account the desire for certainty as his inmost craving and deepest distress, as that which separates the higher human beings from the lower? Among some pious people, I found a hatred of reason and was well disposed to them for that, but this at least betrayed their bad intellectual conscience. But to stand in the midst of this rerum concordia discourse, which means discordant concord of things, and of that whole marvelous uncertainty and rich ambiguity of existence without questioning, without trembling with the craving and the rapture of such questioning, without at least hating the person who questions, perhaps even finding him faintly amusing, that is what I feel to be contemptible. And this is the feeling for which I look in everybody. Some folly keeps persuading me that every human being has this feeling simply because he is human. This is my type of injustice. End quote. Okay, so we talked last season about Nietzsche's view of the pre-Platonics and why this understanding of them, this interpretation of them, is so key to understanding his whole project in philosophy, really. How Nietzsche sees himself, how he sees his own role, and importantly, his own relation to other human beings, and indeed his relation to the entire mass of humanity. One of the most important things to understand about that is that Nietzsche thinks that the philosopher in the time before Socratism and Platonism, those ideologies that tell us that reason is accessible to all human minds, that all minds ought to be bound under logic, all minds can be nurtured to become logical, etc., etc. Prior to that, discernment, as the Greeks would have said nous, meaning the intellect, but specifically the intellect in the sense of one's capacity for a direct and unmistakable apprehension. This trait of discernment is not equally distributed among the populace. In the same way that, as Nietzsche says here, the great majority of people lacks an intellectual conscience. They have no craving for certainty, no desire to know whether their beliefs are true or not, even as they allow those beliefs to motivate their actions or motivate their entire lives. And as Nietzsche writes in Human All Too Human, which was a couple of books prior to this one, people on the whole just receive a morality. They receive their wisdom from the church or from their fathers who tell them, just take this to be true and you'll see how good it feels. This is what the church calls the proof by pleasure, or the proof by strength. The belief is proved strong because it makes you feel good. And that was quite literally an apologetic that the church deployed. And we also see a version of it, I might say, in the work of Pascal, who offers a kind of proof by virtue. That's at the end of his passage containing the wager. That if you live as a Christian, you will see yourself become virtuous and patient and humble and so on. And so, in other words, the desire for certainty on the part of the species is rather weak. Most are not looking for certainty in their beliefs, but pleasure. And, again, the purpose of consciousness seems to be to trick us rather than to lead us to the well of truth. And Nietzsche says here, he's well disposed to pious people in whom there's a hatred of reason. Why? Well, because they're honest. They don't even have the pretense of having an intellectual conscience. As we might imagine, most people would have that pretense. Most people like to see themselves as reasonable, especially in this post-Socratic world that we all live in. Most would say their beliefs are based on reasons. And Nietzsche, as the kind of person who actually does have an intellectual conscience, he says his own form of injustice is that he constantly imagines that people do share this trait with himself. And that at the outset of this passage, section 2, he says he resists that insight, that most people don't have it. But alas, here he commits it to the page, that to do practical justice to the human race, to recognize them for what they are, in the full honesty of one of those priests or the pious people, it would be to admit that the intellectual conscience is a rare thing, not unlike the philosopher's trait of discernment. Because this questioning, as Nietzsche hints here, and we'll certainly see throughout the texts, this questioning can be intensely harmful for one's life-preserving illusions. But again, it's harmful in the proximal sense. Nietzsche's insight that derives from the first aphorism of this text is that such questioning would be of immense benefit to the entire species. So harmful in the proximal sense, beneficial in the final and ultimate sense. And so now that Nietzsche has established the separation of higher beings from the lower, based on the intellectual conscience, which is defined as a desire for certainty about one's beliefs, or this inquisitiveness, what would he later say? The desire for strange, wicked, questionable questions. That's the kind of thing that makes you a disciple of truth. So that's his order of rank that he's established. Nietzsche then moves right along into the next passage to talk about noble and common, which is the title of section 3. He's working from this principle of the essential differences in rank between individuals based on their intellect. Again, intellect in a specific sense, spiritedness or nous. And really, actually, it's their honesty in following it, right? That's why he uses the language of conscience. It's not opting for pleasure or comfort in one's beliefs. It's your capacity to follow the intellect, even when it goes against pleasure or comfort. And so let's move on to section 3. Quote, "Common natures consider all noble, magnanimous feelings inexpedient and therefore, first of all, incredible. They blink when they hear of such things, and seem to feel like saying, 'Surely there must be some advantage involved. One cannot see through everything.' They are suspicious of the noble person, as if he surreptitiously sought his advantage. When they are irresistibly persuaded of the absence of selfish intentions and gains, they see the noble person as a kind of fool. They despise him in his joy and laugh at his shining eyes. How can one enjoy being at a disadvantage? How should one desire, with one's eyes open, to be disadvantaged? Some disease of reason must be associated with that noble affection. Thus they think and sneer, as they sneer at the pleasure that a madman derives from his fixed idea. What distinguishes the common type is that it never loses sight of its advantage, and that this thought of purpose and advantage is even stronger than the strongest instincts. Not to allow these instincts to lead one astray, to perform inexpedient acts, that is their wisdom and pride." End quote. So the common type is defined by never losing sight of what gives personal advantage. Again, in the Spinoza sense, what would be the good of an individual modification of nature. They never lose sight of what is proximally beneficial to themselves. They never see the whole picture. And their pride is in being able to resist those instincts which might lead them to something disadvantageous. And given everything that we've already talked about, that ought to make perfect sense. The way of living of the common people, of the herd types, right, would be to see the instincts in general as a source of potential disadvantage, as something that they must resist in order to resist ending up doing something inexpedient. You have to check your impulses for sex, violence, or material acquisition, because within the framework of society, those are not good instincts to follow. It's anti-natural in that sense. But, again, well, let's return to that, the notion of the intellectual conscience established in the previous aphorism. What would drive this dishonesty, this unwillingness to follow one's intellectual conscience? Well, the pursuit of one's advantage. Because in the proximal sense, it may be of great disadvantage to follow one's intellectual conscience. It might require you to part with cherished beliefs, or to accept things which are immoral, or to scoff at those morality plays of the priests and the tragedians. So why would someone do such a thing? Well, the noble soul enjoys being at a disadvantage. And that might seem strange, but it's actually quite comprehensible. I think the way to explain this is to examine a kind of spirit or kind of feeling that's very common in my country, ironically a country that Nietzsche would have considered to be a rather plebeian country, but that's neither here nor there. The American love for the underdog. There is something noble, something that we simply cannot help but admire about the person who fights against all odds. And there's something even more admirable about the person who fights against all odds and even enjoys this position of disadvantage. The person who is willing to fight with one arm tied behind his back or punch above his weight class, to use two common turns of phrase in contemporary American English. And yet, one would be forced to admit that even as such heroes appear time and again in our stories, even our common popular stories, figures like Frodo Baggins or Rocky Balboa, just to name a couple very popular ones, among the actual common people, what we find instead is a culture of those who, as Steinbeck famously said, are temporarily embarrassed millionaires. The dream, for the most part, among the common people and their perception of what it means to be elevated above the common, to become a higher person, is to become rich, which in their mind means to become comfortable and not have to work or struggle, to live in luxury. These are all very broad overgeneralizations I've just made. I'm sure they could be easily disputed. After all, it's very hard to make any kind of definitive claim about the nature of a culture, since what we're dealing with here are feelings and ideas. But overall, I think the point is rather clear. Nietzsche is appealing to something that our intuition tells us is noble, and is even portrayed as such in our art, but that the population at large does not emulate, and would actually not even want to emulate. They'd actually think you're a fool for emulating it in real life. But there's something deeper here which I think ties in with that general understanding of nature and of our civilization as an outgrowth or an aspect of nature, as Nietzsche discussed it back in section 1, and that is that we as living beings seek to deliver ourselves from the state of nature and its sufferings and its privations. We seek to deliver ourselves from life as an animal. We don't want to live in instinct. We don't want to be locked in this constant struggle for existence. This tension, this struggle to extricate ourselves from something that we can never extricate ourselves from, that's the thing that advances life. And the great majority, the herd as Nietzsche calls them, will seek their pleasure in that deliverance, in that extrication from suffering, whereas the noble individual, as Nietzsche defines him here, and Nietzsche hasn't really given us anything besides this in this particular book yet, so this is all we have to go on so far as to what constitutes the noble. That's the one who takes pleasure within the struggle, within the suffering. And Nietzsche invokes something here in the following paragraph that we can also find in Plato's Symposium, in the section where Socrates cites the words of the high priestess Diotima. So Nietzsche goes on, quote, "Compared to them, the higher type is more unreasonable. For those who are noble, magnanimous, and self-sacrificial do succumb to their instincts, and when they are at their best, their reason pauses. An animal that protects its young at the risk of its life, or that during the mating period follows the female even into death, does not think of danger and death. Its reason also pauses, because the pleasure in its young, or in the female, and the fear of being deprived of this pleasure dominate it totally. The animal becomes more stupid than usual, just like those who are noble and magnanimous. They have some feelings of pleasure and displeasure that are so strong that they reduce the intellect to silence or to servitude. At that point, their heart displaces the head and one speaks of passion. Now and then we also encounter the opposite, and as it were, the reversal of passion. For example, somebody once laid his hand on Fontenelle's heart, saying to him, 'What you have there, dear sir, is another brain.'" End quote. So Fontenelle is one of those French aphorists that Nietzsche cites in Human All Too Human as incomparable, that they're more akin to the great writers of classical antiquity than to the writers of modernity. And Nietzsche's meaning is a bit obscure here, I think, because he just laid out the way in which the noble's reason pauses, the way the noble gives into pure instinct, the noble gives into passion without letting himself be seduced by his reason. But Fontenelle is the kind of man whose passions, even his passions, seem to be intellectual. He's a man with a second brain instead of a heart. But I think the meaning here can be untangled with the understanding that a noble person like Fontenelle does not experience his instincts as a conflict with his intellect the way the common person does. Remember, feeling as though he has to overcome his instincts in order to avoid doing anything inexpedient. That is the malady of the common person, because the common man's aristocracy is the priest, right? The common person's way of being throughout the history of Europe is Christianity, the Christian morality and metaphysics, which is a dualistic metaphysics, soul versus body, the division of one's impulses into good and bad impulses, and so on. But in the example of the animal that fights to the death on behalf of its offspring, its reason, quote-unquote, pauses, because everyone's reason, it seems, is aimed at self-preservation, at gaining personal advantage, at gaining personal pleasure. But the animal that finds its greater pleasure in its offspring is, in fact, to say it a different way from the way Nietzsche says it, is in fact being reasonable in a higher sense. It's a primitive, primordial reason, and yet it's being like supra-reasonable. Because once again, the most reasonable thing, seen from on the highest height, is to work for the advancement of the species, because there is no preserving individuals. There is no meaning to individual or personal advantage or pleasure, except insofar as these things are means. They're mere instruments to some higher purpose of nature. So in the noble, we find both the more natural and the more reasonable individual, the unity of heart and head. And so Nietzsche continues in section 3, quote, "The reason or counter-reason of passion is what the common type despises in the noble, especially when this passion is directed towards objects whose value seems quite fantastic and arbitrary. One is annoyed with those who succumb to the passion of the belly, but at least one comprehends the attraction that plays the tyrant in such cases. But one cannot comprehend how anyone could risk his health and honor for the sake of a passion for knowledge. The taste of the higher type is for exceptions, for things that leave most people cold and seem to lack sweetness. The higher type has a singular value standard. Moreover, it usually believes that the idiosyncrasy of its taste is not a singular value standard, rather it posits its values and disvalues as generally valid, and thus becomes incomprehensible and impractical. Very rarely does a higher nature retain sufficient reason for understanding and treating everyday people as such. For the most part, this type assumes that its own passion is present, but kept concealed in all men. And this belief even becomes an ardent and eloquent faith. But when such exceptional people do not see themselves as the exception, how can they ever understand the common type and arrive at a fair evaluation of the rule? Thus they too speak of the folly, inexpediency, and fantasies of humanity, stunned that the course of the world should be so insane, and puzzled that it won't own up to what is needful. This is the eternal injustice of those who are noble." End quote. And so the noble has a kind of passion that drives his intellect, and in some sense, in the noble, they're one and the same. That passion, that impulse, is that desire to fight and struggle, which is a healthy natural impulse. And the noble among human beings, which is, as we've established it, the conscious rational animal, is therefore in a way the healthiest animal, who consequently seeks his fight, seeks his struggle in the realm of the intellect. How could anyone risk his health or honor for the sake of a passion for knowledge? That's the question that Nietzsche asks, which is what seems so puzzling to the common people, because the realm of knowledge is so cold and so lacking in sweetness, right? It's such a rarefied taste. It might make sense that their reason might pause for a passion of the belly, right? For lust or something like that. But a passion for knowledge? I'm reminded of what Nietzsche says in the 1886 preface to Birth of Tragedy when describing the pessimism of strength. that one might risk his health or honor for the sake of a passion for knowledge if he has what Nietzsche calls an intellectual predilection for all that is hard, terrible, and questionable about existence. And so Nietzsche finishes this passage in The Gay Science by recapitulating to a previous point, in a sense explaining his own injustice done to mankind by being unwilling to see that they lack an intellectual conscience. Well, of course, he would tend to think this because the higher types, up until now, do not consider their own way of being, their own way of valuing and judging, their valuing of struggle, and their own predilection for hard and terrible challenges. They don't consider this as a singular standard, as something peculiar to themselves, but as a universal. And that is the tyrannical nature, the injustice of all value judgments, isn't it? That in a way they're all thou shalts, as Nietzsche writes in Zarathustra, began as an I will. And yet it's another one of those follies, it's another naivete of human beings that we take these I wills and extrapolate them as reigning over all mankind. And so Nietzsche's own injustice, again using that word in a somewhat comedic and tongue-in-cheek sense, is an injustice that he shares with all those who are noble. And I think it should be said, just as a brief note, that as I have often remarked, these statements are Nietzsche's way of seducing you. He is not making these claims for a dispassionate reason. Nietzsche knows that, at least within certain human beings, these ideas he's presenting will be very attractive on the very basis that they promise not comfort, not pleasure, at least not pleasure in the base sense of personal hedonic pleasure, but that they promise struggle. And so this is his way of casting his net as a fisherman on high mountains. That's a metaphor he uses in one of his dithyrambic poems. Some people will read these pages and say, this all sounds horrible. Some will read this and say, yes, I feel that way too. I want to follow my intellectual conscience. I want to be certain. I don't want to have comfort. I want the higher pleasure of a kind of domain of struggle within the realm of philosophy. And that is all very seductive. Another thing that comes to mind, Nietzsche says in his lectures on the Sophists, the Greeks would rather be persuaded than convinced. And Nietzsche takes his cues from the Greek Sophists in that way. He would rather speak beautifully and persuade you, find those who would rather be persuaded in that way. And he gives little to no effort towards attempting to logically convince anyone of any of the points he's made so far. All right, let's move on to section 4. Quote, what preserves the species? The strongest and most evil spirits have so far done the most to advance humanity. Again and again they relumed the passions that were going to sleep. All ordered society puts the passions to sleep. And they reawakened again and again the sense of comparison, of contradiction, of the pleasure in what is new, daring, untried. They compelled men to pit opinion against opinion, model against model, usually by force of arms, by toppling boundary markers, by violating pieties, but also by means of new religions and moralities. In every teacher and preacher of what is new, we encounter the same wickedness that makes conquerors notorious, even if its expression is subtler and does not immediately set the muscles in motion, and therefore also does not make one that notorious. What is new, however, is always evil, being that which wants to conquer and overthrow the old boundary markers and the old pieties. And only what is old is good. The good men are in all ages those who dig the old thoughts, digging deep and getting them to bear fruit, the farmers of the spirit. But eventually all land is exploited, and the plowshare of evil must come again and again. Nowadays there is a profoundly erroneous moral doctrine that is celebrated especially in England. This holds that judgments of good and evil sum up experiences of what is called expedient and inexpedient. One holds that what is called good preserves the species, while what is called evil harms the species. In truth, however, the evil instincts are expedient, species-preserving, and indispensable to as high a degree as the good ones. Their function is merely different." End quote. So with all the interpretive work that we've already done, all the groundwork that's already been laid, there's not as much to say about this passage, except for a few observations that I think follow very easily from all that's already been said. First of all, Nietzsche makes it explicit here. The harmful man, the type that has been called the most evil type of man, is actually, in his view, more beneficial to the species than the beneficent man, the patient, humble herd animal that Pascal's morality would have us emulate and aim to emulate. And so what he said in the first aphorism is that neither harms the species, the good or the evil type of man. As far as which one does more to benefit the species, he says here, the evil man does more. And the reason why should be clear from his meditations on the noble type in the previous section. Civilization is established within the struggle of nature. It's established by those who thrive in the struggle. The herd type merely reaps the rewards of being civilized. It's in the same way that the mutation, the exception, is regarded from one standpoint, the proximal standpoint, harmful to the genome. But the genome itself, how is it created? Well, it's established by millions of such mutations, all of which were initially aberrant, different, a challenge to the status quo when they first emerged, but which now has shaped the genome and has defined it. It's the mutation that's the driving force of evolution. But the individuals, we might say the individual instantiations of that genome, then come to regard the genome as it is now, as being of the highest value, and preserving the genome as it is now, as being the activity of the highest value. But let's take it to the moral realm, and the way that every I will becomes a thou shalt. So for example, when the Prophet Muhammad first appeared on the Arabian Peninsula, he was a terrible mutation in the moral sense. He threatened the status quo of all those tribes of polytheists who wanted, obviously, to maintain their way of life as it was. But after generations of war and conquest, in which Islam is established as the new religion of the region with a new reigning morality, that then comes to dominate and reshape the lives and the worldview of all who fall under its spell, that mutating force, that evil type of man who spread his faith by the sword, well, that faith of his is no longer the exception. It's now the rule. So what is new always appears as evil. That is the enduring prejudice of the herd. But little do they know that whatever is old, whatever is established, whatever way of life they're living in now, whatever morality that they accept now, was once one of those new, wicked, terrible, evil ideas. And finally, in this passage, Nietzsche's explicit rejection of utilitarianism. Not on the grounds that we shouldn't care about what is expedient. That's not, at least in this passage, that's not the basis of his critique. Rather, that all that we consider to be evil or harmful or wicked is in fact expedient. That again, seen from the final standpoint, rather than the immediate and proximal standpoint, that common standpoint, which only seeks to preserve or maintain what is now. But again, from that final standpoint, it is expedient. And so it's not an objection to utilitarianism in the way that a deontologist might object by saying that what is expedient doesn't matter, that we have certain moral duties we have to follow, even if they're not expedient. Rather, that we have to adjust our level of perspective for understanding what is truly expedient. What is expedient for nature? That might be totally inexpedient for the individual. And in fact, we might even say this is always the case because nature uses even our perishing, and that is inevitable. So Nietzsche's critique of utilitarians in this passage is in many ways, we might say, a historical critique, a psychological critique, we might say a biological critique would be more accurate. That Nietzsche thinks that, to put it simply, the utilitarian account of how mankind comes to value, how mankind comes to assign good or evil as categories to things and people and events, etc., it's simply incorrect. It's another one of our follies because it's based on the common assessment of that what is good is what gives personal advantage. What is good is what preserves us as we are now, which is a folly because it fails to see how the current status quo was itself created by a disruption to the previous status quo. What we call good now is simply the old truths that were once new and that those in past ages would have called evil in the highest degree. And that from the broadest perspective, we would therefore have to see that the evil type of human being is paradoxically the best type, because that evil type is the creator in all ages. The creative destructive force is the evil person that comes in and tears up the old boundaries and destroys the old moralities and establishes new things. That is the constant renewal, the plowshares of evil that always return. Okay, let's move on to section 5. Quote, unconditional duties. All those who feel they need the strongest words and sounds, the most eloquent gestures and postures in order to be effective at all, such as revolutionary politicians, socialists, preachers of repentance with or without Christianity, all of whom cannot tolerate semi-successes, talk of duties, and actually always of duties that are supposed to be unconditional. Without that, they would lack the justification for their great pathos, and they understand this very well. Thus they reach for moral philosophies that preach some categorical imperative, or they ingest a goodly piece of religion, as Mazzini did, for example. Because they desire the unconditional confidence of others, they need first of all to develop unconditional self-confidence on the basis of some ultimate and indisputable commandment that is inherently sublime, and they want to feel like and be accepted as its servants and instruments. Here we have the most natural and usually very influential opponents of moral enlightenment and skepticism, but they are rare. Yet a very comprehensive class of such opponents is to be found wherever self-interest requires submission, while reputation and honor seem to prohibit submission. Whoever feels that his dignity is incompatible with the thought of being the instrument of a prince or party or sect, or even worse, of a financial power, say because he is, after all, the descendant of an old and proud family, but who nevertheless wants to, or must be such an instrument before himself and before the public, requires pompous principles that can be mouthed at any time, principles of some unconditional obligation to which one may submit without shame. Refined servility clings to the categorical imperative and is the mortal enemy of those who wish to deprive duty of its unconditional character. That is what decency demands of them, and not only decency. End quote. And so, as if to establish that Nietzsche's objection to these utilitarian considerations in the previous passage is not deontological, he immediately goes on in the next section to dissect all this talk of moral duties, so that we don't mistake his critique. Mazzini, the figure that Nietzsche mentions here, as Kaufmann explains in his footnote, had hoped to write a history of Italy, but with the underlying purpose of showing how the destiny of the Italian people was part of God's plan, essentially. That there was a divine mission for Italy, a kind of divine duty for Italy. Nietzsche doesn't bring this up to lambast the deontologists necessarily. Again, this is all another folly of the consciousness, we might say, another illusion. But the language of moral duties allows one to present themselves as a mere servant or instrument of some higher power, some higher purpose, a categorical imperative, a direct reference to Kant, and thereby to draw along others, capture the minds of others, to say, well, I am only the representative of a higher morality, a divine commandment. I'm only the servant of God, or I'm only the instrument of historical dialectical materialism, like realizing the dictatorship of the proletariat. I am just the instrument of history or something like that. I bring up socialism here because Nietzsche does at the beginning of the passage. And this is an incredibly powerful psychological tool. And that is the level of Nietzsche's analysis yet again, psychological, historical. In a way, it's all very scientific. The notion that Nietzsche is anti-science, I think, is simply absurd in the light of many of these passages. The very meaning of the gay science, to see clearly the reason for all such beliefs, for all such moralities and philosophies. Why would mankind come up with the idea of unconditional duties? It's one thing to simply dismiss the idea of an unconditional duty. It's quite another undertaking to try to discern why it was, or why it is that such a thing as unconditional duties or divine commandments would come about in the human mind, or why they would have purchase. And given all that Nietzsche has established leading up to this, we can again conclude it's another way that life has of seducing us to advance the species. I'll stop repeating that point after a while, I promise, but I just wanted to drill it in while we're going over these early aphorisms, that for Nietzsche we really have no choice. So let's move on. We'll go to section 6 here. Quote, loss of dignity. Reflecting has lost all the dignity of its form. the ceremony and solemn gestures of reflecting have become ridiculous, and an old-style wise man would be considered intolerable. We think too fast, even while walking or on the way, or while engaged in other things, no matter how serious the subject. We require little preparation, not even much silence. It is as if we carried in our heads an unstoppable machine that keeps working even under the most unfavorable circumstances. Formerly, one could tell simply by looking at a person that he wanted to think. It was probably a rare occurrence. That he now wished to become wiser and prepared himself for a thought. He set his face as for prayer and stopped walking. Yes, one even stood still for hours in the middle of the road when the thought arrived, on one leg or two legs. That seemed to be required by the dignity of the matter." End quote. The points that Nietzsche makes here may also seem a bit obscure at a first glance. I'm going to cross-reference his remarks here with another aphorism which comes a bit later in this book of the Gay Science, Book 1, which is entitled Ancient Pride, and we'll probably get to that one next week. But I think bringing it up here helps explain the underlying thrust of Section 6 if we sort of combine those insights there along with some of the considerations we've already made, such as the exception as the driving force, the evil type as the one who establishes all things that eventually become common, the status quo, the moral norm, etc., etc. So thinking used to be very hard. Thinking is something that evolved, that developed historically, biologically. It's very hard for us to understand what a subversive idea that is until we really comprehend the Christian view of things. How utterly different it is. In the Christian view, thinking preceded being. Life itself did not exist in any embodied physical form prior to thinking. The original form of being is the mind of God. So if we assume the inverse, though, that life emerged and that living beings developed thinking, we would have to come to the conclusion that just like every other hard-won trait of living beings, every ounce of grace, beauty, virtue, etc., thought would also have to be hard-won. It would have to be tempered in the fires of hell, as Nick Land would have put it. It would also have to be forged out of the endless struggles within nature and all of nature's caprice and wastefulness and indifference. And so accordingly, the wise man would have been a rare type, a strange type of person, and perhaps a far greater degree of effort had to be devoted towards thinking than before. And so in that other aphorism we'll get to next week, Ancient Pride, Nietzsche notes how the ancient morality set this wide gulf between the status of the free man and the slave. They were hyper aware of it. He contrasts it as sort of a difference with modernity that we don't know who's a free man and who's a slave in some sense. It's all hidden to us. But the philosophers of ancient Greece came to the conclusion, interestingly, that there were far more slaves than most men perceived. The philosopher set himself far above the average person because only the philosopher had discernment, and the philosophers perceived that the one without discernment would be akin to a mere slave because he would be pushed in every direction by impulses, and he'd be driven by unfounded beliefs, and he would act a certain way, but just out of tradition or, without examining those beliefs, without an intellectual conscience, right? He would act in pursuit of pleasures without being able to examine whether hedonistic pleasures or personal advantage were really the type of pleasures that one ought to invest their effort into, the highest value into, right? And so the philosopher was a rare exceptional type, which is to say the thinking person was an exception. And I should also note, Nietzsche is exactly doing all of these same things that he attributes to the ancient philosophers. Nietzsche also comes along and says, there are far more slaves around than we actually realize. So that's kind of interesting. But the situation is different today. As regards thinking, right? I mean, what has happened? Well, as Nietzsche says, we think fast. We think all the time. We think while doing other things. We have a million thoughts wheeling through our heads. That's sort of the anxious, manic state of the modern man. And why is that? Well, thought was once an exception, but now it has become common. Thought is cheap now. It's no longer exceptional. In ancient times, each new thought it had to come like a handmade artisanal thought, right? But now we think as if our brains are just these machines churning out thought. And Once again, you could make your own value judgments about these observations, but notice the structure of the argument here. How the status quo was established by the exception. And once again, it should be noted, the philosopher was once a problematic, evil type in past ages. The most famous example of that being Socrates, the corrupter of youth. So, but it doesn't just apply to Socrates. The philosopher's wisdom, the word that the Greeks used for that type of wisdom, carried the meaning of being useless. The Greeks, as Nietzsche says in his early writings, they're the political men par excellence, but philosophy, that leads people like Heraclitus to abandon politics and abandon civic life, for example. So the early philosopher, even before Socrates, is another type that at first seemed harmful. Moving on now to section 7. Quote, something for the industrious. Anyone who now wishes to make a study of moral matters opens up for himself an immense field for work. All kinds of individual passions have to be thought through and pursued through different ages, peoples, and great and small individuals. All their reason and all their evaluations and perspectives on things have to be brought into the light. So far, all that has given color to existence still lacks a history. Where could you find a history of love, of avarice, of envy, of conscience, of pious respect for tradition, or of cruelty? Even a comparative history of law, or at least of punishment, is so far lacking completely. End quote. I wanted to make a quick note here. Arguably, Nietzsche produces just this when he writes his genealogy. It's a history of law and punishment. And at least that's part of the work, right? And the meaning of the title of this section, Something for the Industrious, becomes clear there, therefore. This gay science that Nietzsche wishes to create offers a cornucopia of opportunities for new study. So long as we aren't writing a history for the reason that Mazzini did, right? To give a history of Italy for the purposes of some moral aim in the present, then perhaps we could write, well, for lack of a better term, a real history. So long as we can safely discard the moralist aim of designating certain people or actions as good or evil because they are expedient or inexpedient from the perspective of our personal advantage in the here and now, perhaps instead of that, we could investigate the real origins of our designations, good and evil, the real history of punishment, the real history of law. And that's what Nietzsche goes on to do. But here he's bringing it up as a sort of enticement for the industrious person. The person of modernity, we might say, who needs his mind shaft of research to work on. Well, Nietzsche says, quite seductively, my new immoralist way of doing science offers that to you. It offers a more immense horde of opportunities than you've ever had. But back to the passage. Quote, has anyone made a study of different ways of dividing up the day or the consequences of a regular schedule of work, festivals, and rest? What is known of the moral effects of different foods? Is there any philosophy of nutrition? And end quote. Another quick note, this is the beginning of Nietzsche's physiologism, as I have called it, and we can see this kind of thought on full display in his Ecce Homo. This is how Nietzsche evaluates his own life. He inquires as to how his diet, his environment, his experiences, and his friendships, or even his solitude, have made him what he is. And he argues that while these have always been considered as the little things, the trivial things, things of not much importance compared to the grand moral and metaphysical narratives, that in fact these are the real key to understanding a human being. And that they're actually the root of those grand moral and metaphysical narratives, that those, again, are mere signs or symptoms. The real origin is the physiology, which therefore would be more advantageous to us to study things like diet and nutrition. And then consequently, we could expand that insight beyond the level of the individual to a whole society, a whole group, or a whole species. Skipping a little further down in the passage, quote, whatever men have so far viewed as the conditions of their existence, and all the reason, passion, and superstition involved in such a view, has this been researched exhaustively? The most industrious people will find that it involves too much work simply to observe how differently men's instincts have grown, and might yet grow, depending on different moral climates. It would require whole generations, and generations of scholars who would collaborate systematically to exhaust the points of view and the material. The same applies to the demonstration of the reasons for the differences between moral climates. Why is it that the sun of one fundamental moral judgment and main standard of value shines here and another one there? And it would be yet another job to determine the erroneousness of all these reasons and the whole nature of moral judgments to date. If all these jobs were done, the most insidious question of all would emerge into the foreground: whether science can furnish goals of action after it has proved that it can take such goals away and annihilate them. And then experimentation would be in order that would allow every kind of heroism to find satisfaction. Centuries of experimentation that might eclipse all the great projects and sacrifices of history to date. So far, science has not yet built its cyclopic buildings, but the time for that too will come." End quote. I have to remark here again on the simple fact that the people who construe Nietzsche as an irrationalist or anti-science are just simply wrong. Nietzsche almost reads like a positivist here from a certain perspective. I personally wouldn't categorize him that way, and he provides important critiques of positivist thought throughout his career. But nevertheless, Nietzsche at least raises the question here of whether scientific thought could provide us with new valuations, given that, as we've seen, it at least has the power to destroy the old ones. So could science ever have its own period of cyclopean building? The translation, Kaufman's translation, renders it cyclopic. I don't think that's right. It should be cyclopean, because cyclopean means large, gargantuan. It does refer to the Cyclops, but specifically the size of the Cyclops. So we might say the great wonders of the ancient world: pyramids of Giza, the Sphinx, the Colossus of Rhodes. These were the cyclopean buildings that came out of the religious view of the world of past ages. These were the grand projects of construction that produced these amazing edifices, which are these testaments to the human will, aesthetic gifts to the legacy of mankind. Now, suppose that this new project, this gay science that seeks a clarity of consciousness, clarity about the purpose of existence, seen from the perspective of nature, suppose that could ever succeed. Well, then perhaps science could have its own cyclopean projects of building, its own sort of great testaments to the human will, its own attempt at forging new valuations, giving man new values. The difference between Nietzsche and a garden variety scientific positivist of today is that Nietzsche, when he speaks of science throughout these passages, or throughout the entire book, he's really speaking about his new kind of science. His problem with the old way of doing science, well, in some sense, it's that they're not sufficiently scientific. Science has, for example, never applied itself to the question of values, never asked where values come from and how they are created. And why not? Well, because we accepted existing values, and the scientists did too. And in the same way that one doesn't question Christian virtues if one is a Christian, because, in some sense, God said it, you do it. The Bible's the word of God, and God is truth, and so on and so forth. Well, if you accepted all the moral suppositions of your age, your time and place, if you turn your intellectual conscience toward those suppositions, that's necessarily going to be seen as immoral. And usually, Nietzsche argues, most people who are scientific positivists just end up trying to create logical arguments for why, or scientific arguments for why we ought to behave in a way that we already believe we ought to behave in, right? So we're talking about science in the sense of Nietzsche's immoralism, as he lays it out in Beyond Good and Evil. We're talking about following our will to truth, even into an examination of the value of that will to truth. Exploring the question of what is good, even up to the point of asking the meta question, how is it that mankind has decided what is good? So Nietzsche is an advocate for science in the same way that he is a disciple of truth, but he believes we should be truthful about the nature of the search for truth and have the honesty of conscience to follow that path where it leads. So again, it's not quite accurate to say Nietzsche is anti-science or irrationalist. I really dislike those kinds of characterizations. All right, let's go to section 8. Quote, unconscious virtues. All the human qualities of which we are conscious, and especially those whose visibility and obviousness for others too we take for granted, are subject to altogether different laws of development than are those qualities which we know either badly or not at all, and which also conceal themselves by means of their subtlety, even from very subtle observers, knowing how to hide, as it were, behind nothing at all. It is similar with the subtle sculptures and the scales of reptiles. It would be wrong to take them for ornaments or weapons, for they become visible only under a microscope, under an artificially sharpened eye that similar animals for which these little sculptures might signify ornaments or weapons simply lack. Our visible moral qualities, and especially those we believe to be visible, follow their own course, and the invisible ones that have the same names, but are in relation to other men neither ornaments nor weapons, also follow their own course, probably a wholly different course, and they probably have lines, subtleties, and sculptures that might give pleasure to a god with a divine microscope. Thus we have, for example, our industry, our ambition, our acuteness. All the world knows about that. But in addition to all that, we probably also have our industry, our ambition, our acuteness. But for these reptile scales, no microscope has been invented as yet. At this point, the friends of instinctive morality will say, "Bravo, at least he considers unconscious virtues possible, and that suffices us. Oh, you were satisfied with so little." End quote. So this passage, it conveys once again the Nietzschean attitude towards consciousness as something that conceals more than it reveals. And that turns the typical attitude of philosophers towards consciousness totally on its head. And Nietzsche would say that this is because philosophers in the past had turned the truth on her head, and that he's simply, turning the truth back upright again. But the consciousness is a superficial thing, a kind of skin. It reveals something, but it conceals even more. And here he uses the example of a lizard's scales with such intricate patterns as can only be seen by a microscope, meaning that, of course, those sculptures, as he calls them, could not have value in the world of the lizards or reptiles because they wouldn't even perceive these patterns or sculptures. They're not sensed within the world of appearances that organism lives within. And so overall, this passage ties in with the Nietzschean assertion that would later become a key aspect of psychoanalysis, the perception that there's a vast underworld of the psyche that never comes into the consciousness, that, as Nietzsche writes in his notes, the great activity is unconscious. But unlike perhaps a Freudian who might fixate on all those base or uncomfortable drives within us, all that we wish to conceal because it's too embarrassing or too painful for the ego to claim it, Nietzsche here focuses on unconscious virtues. Nietzsche thinks that who we are, each of us, in a very real sense, who we are is something uncommunicable by the means of consciousness, by means of rational discursive communication. Each of us may have our outward virtues or outward vices, but within us are our own unique virtues, which don't even really have a name, because names are something for traits that are, or for phenomena that are generalizable or experienceable by others. I don't think that's a word, experienceable, but we're coining it. That your uniqueness could never be communicable because what exists in the realm of conscious communication always tends toward the lowest common denominator. And it's really worth contemplating that term, lowest common denominator. That on the other extreme end, that which is absolutely and uniquely you, that's always uncommunicable. It's unconscious even to your own consciousness. And that final line that Nietzsche includes in this passage, again, shows some of that Nietzschean cheekiness that is really there throughout this entire book. The moralists, particularly the ones who believe in instinctive morality, so the people who think human beings are naturally good, right? The moralists will read this and say, oh, look, Nietzsche does believe in virtues. He believes in unconscious virtues. Well, that's enough for me. That's enough either to say that Nietzsche still, you could interpret it a couple ways. It's enough because Nietzsche still has to justify himself morally, as if to prove the moralist position. Or it's enough to say that even if Nietzsche is correct, the instinctive moralist, the believer in instinctive morals, he can still rest easy that virtues exist. There's a kind of moral center or moral reality inherent to the human being. And Nietzsche basically laughs at this kind of reaction to what he's saying. And because The somewhat tricky thing that Nietzsche is doing here is using the term virtue in a rather immoralist way, and the way that he uses the term virtu, as he says in the Antichrist, in the Renaissance sense, which really means virtue as a trait or quality that one has, a strength or power that one has. And so given that he's redefining virtue, true virtue, the truest kind of virtue, which he defines here as unconscious, he redefines that as something totally amoral. And so the moralist actually shouldn't be happy with this, but they're satisfied with so little. I love that line, which I think if we read between the lines of this passage, we should be able to see that as a dig at moralists, at the fact that like Mazzini, who he mentions before, so many can look into the history of the human race, or the history of their country, or whatever it might be. You know, with all the vicious power struggles and base-born aims and animalistic impulses, and say, look, this is the story of an unfolding moral telos for the human race. We can look at the history of the Roman Empire, which is what? It's a millennia of conquest and massacres and rapes and slavery and torture and so on. And then in the time of Christendom, they can look back on that and say, well, that was simply the backdrop and pretext for the unfolding of the greatest story ever told, right? The coming of Christ and the overthrow of paganism at the hands of Christianity. That's the reason for that millennia of an absolute horror show from the moral perspective. So the moralists are satisfied with so little because they can weigh that single story of the man who's willingly martyred, allegedly in order to save mankind. They can weigh that as equal to the millennia of human nature on display in the Roman Empire. And the moralists can then reinterpret that into a mere background context and prerequisite for their story. So, the moralists are happy with very little. All right, we're going to look at only one more passage today, section 9. And I quote, "Our eruptions, countless things that humanity acquired in earlier stages, but so feebly and embryonically that nobody could perceive this acquisition, suddenly emerge into the light much later, perhaps after centuries. Meanwhile, they have become strong and ripe. Some ages seem to lack altogether some talent or some virtue, as certain individuals do too. But just wait for their children and grandchildren, if you have time to wait that long. They bring to light what was hidden in their grandfathers and what their grandfathers themselves did not suspect. Often the son betrays his father, and the father understands himself better after he has a son. All of us harbor concealed gardens and plantings, and to use another metaphor, we are, all of us, growing volcanoes that approach the hour of their eruption. But how near or distant that is, nobody knows, not even God." End quote. I think this section is self-explanatory in some sense. It just doesn't require that much interpretive legwork. But it is an interesting notion in that Nietzsche is providing us with an interpretation of mankind's history in the way that the moralist does throughout this whole first aphorisms we've looked at, but rather than the unfolding destiny of mankind as something consciously dictated or determined, as by a god. In Nietzsche's view, the destiny of mankind is the unfolding of that which was previously unconscious, or previously merely latent within the organism, which eventually grows and comes to fruition. So the basis of consciousness is the unconscious. The basis of our virtues today, perhaps, is traits that were not even in the awareness of our forefathers. And so there's a significance here on the level of Nietzsche's project of affirmative philosophy, the revaluation of values and the overman and so on. The idea that we are all volcanoes ready to erupt with some new powerful iteration of life that we ourselves have not hitherto perceived or even understood. And we might again think of the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, which I think is useful to compare to this passage. Nietzsche's argument there is that we should not be ungrateful to the follies of Platonism, or to Christianity, which he there calls Platonism for the people, that these great errors, which bestrided the world in monstrous and frightening masks, as he said, they made the highest demands of humankind, and they were errors, but they created this most enormous tension of the spirit, as he says. And he also references grand styles of building in that passage. Again, the projects of Cyclopean building that came out of previous erroneous views, religious, metaphysical, moral views, which we might say that those errors justify themselves by the very fact that they did create these testaments to human striving. And this tension of the spirit that is created in the wake of these movements is not something that we should lament. Rather, it is like the bow of the soul has been drawn taut, so that now we can shoot for the farthest goals. That's the sense in which Nietzsche here writes, albeit with another metaphor, that of the plant which is gestated underground and eventually bursts up into the light, or the volcano that with its magma smoldering under the surface, the pressure building for an eruption. Perhaps all of this human history is the prelude to some new way of life, some new way of being which we can't even conceive of yet. But again, far from the moralist interpretation, which sees life as aiming at some sort of end, which always happens to be an end that we in the present already believe in and have already uncovered, such as the Christian story, right? Everything in history leads to the revelation of Christianity, or the Hegelian story, everything in philosophy leads to the revelation of the absolute mind, which arrives with Hegel himself. Well, Nietzsche is willing instead to retain an element of mystery here, suggests that not even God knows when and what this eruption shall be. Now, of course, this is somewhat sneaky, because Nietzsche has in fact told us what he believes is driving this entire thing: the purposes of nature, the elevation of the species, however we want to say it. And Nietzsche clearly has his own hopes and his own ideas about the future direction of humanity, what would be ideal for us. But if I were to steelman Nietzsche's position, I think he can fall back on the argument that, true as that may be, Nietzsche does not attempt to give an explanation for that story of human history by appealing to the moral ideas that we currently hold. He doesn't appeal to the current zeitgeist. In a way, he appeals to their opposite. He doesn't attempt to give us a vision of humanity which will suit our personal pleasure, that will provide a metaphysical comfort. Instead, he offers us a vision that is in some ways quite difficult to look at, and perhaps in the way that Nietzsche reverses the popular wisdom by claiming that the harmful type is the most beneficial to the species, perhaps he can claim that his discomforting wisdom is the most beneficial to the development of thinking, the development of philosophy, that the value here is precisely, and that Nietzsche is willing to consider the development of mankind as an organism in terms that go against our good feelings, that go against our moral inclinations, and that, therefore, he's capable of a truly scientific way of approaching the question. Only those with an intellectual conscience will, therefore, be able to follow him down this path, and those types will be few and far between. All right, that's all. That's all for this first foray into this book. Join me next week when we will jump right back in, starting with section 10. Thank you once again for joining me. I will see you next time. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.